I'm excited.
Thor's arm.
Okay. Okay, here we go.
Must be his arm.
Oh, where's the sound? Come on.
Let's see where I can see the screen.
Let's try that again.
That was about to shake that dude.
He's not salty, over puffy, kinda hulky superhero, optimistic and electrically transistored superhero, and exotically erotic and aquatic superhero. The Marvel superheroes have arrived, superpowered from the forehead till the toes. Watch them change their very shape before you know. See our cape striking superhero change to Viking superhero, a humbling and real swinging, shield flinging superhero. They're the latest, they're the greatest, ultimate superheroes. The Marvel superheroes have arrived.
Looked like it was in.
Now, most people think this is when the Marvel superheroes arrive with the Avengers movies. Look, I'm sorry, I forgot that the songs are connected. But they really arrived in American pop culture. Oops, what happened here? There we go. 50 years ago, in 1966, in the fall, in Esquire magazine, the first time a mainstream magazine featured Jack Kirby's Marvel characters. And of course, the lead character there in the center is Captain America, the character that Kirby most enjoyed drawing over his career. Look how different he looked when he was started here, actually a sketch by his partner, co-creator Joe Simon. Okay. But a part of Captain America was in Jack Kirby, and a part of Jack Kirby was in Captain America. And so much of Kirby's background, growing up as Ya'akov Kurtzberg in the Lower East Side of New York City, shown here in a drawing by Kirby from 1990 in an autobiographical story called Street Code. So much of Kirby's work is in this background that he came out of, but at the same time, this uneducated son of Jewish American immigrants also creates this psycho-architectural wonder world that we're still trying to figure out where he got it from. That is the genius of the man we're here to discuss on the centennial of his birth, Jack Kirby. And I'm honored here that the San Diego Comicfest has invited me that I could debut something I've been looking forward to debuting for the last couple of years. So thank you all for being here. And let's talk about the man, Jack Kirby. In my book, The Silver Age of Comic Art, it's the longest chapter because, again, Kirby did the most work in the Silver Age. Ghosted behind the type there on the right is that autobiographical image. That was the very first image inker Mike Royer, who was just here, inked of Jack Kirby in 1970, and it was done for Marvel Mania magazine, which Mark Evanier and Steve Sherman, who were here at the convention, did. And there's a picture of Kirby from, I think, the first issue of Marvel Mania magazine. And in his background, you can maybe see if he resembles his mother and father, the Kurtzbergs, who grew up, who came to America and came to the Lower East Side in New York City, of which this is a colorized, authentic photograph from, I think, 1909 or something like that. And you can see that Kirby's drawing from Street Code really sticks to that. And there's young Jack Kirby, young artist, probably at about the time that he was drawing in between cells for the Fleischer Studios on Popeye in the mid-1930s. Now here's a shot of a New York City newsstand from 1938. Why is this shot of a newsstand from 1938 significant? Well, if you look at the bottom row there, what do you see but Action Comics #1, the debut of Superman. So young Ya'akov Kurtzberg changed his name to Jack Kirby, and his partner Jaime Simon changed his name to Joe. There they are working for the fledgling DC Comics on the Boy Commandos, one of the many genres that Kirby would create over the course of his incredible career. So together, Simon and Kirby, they worked on, like everybody else in the industry, superhero knockoffs after Superman debuted. So they have the Red Raven, they have the Blue Bolt, all of these lasted very few issues here and there. But they were more concerned with what was happening over in Europe in the late 30s and early 40s. And they were two young Jews that wanted to basically raise the consciousness of America about what was happening. If you know your history, America didn't want to fight Europe's war. We were very isolationist, and they certainly weren't going to fight a war to save the Jews. So what did two Jews do? They create the ultimate American icon, Captain America, that would exactly do that. He's created almost a year before Pearl Harbor, and he's an overnight success. Here, that image that was drawn by Joe Simon, there it's ended up drawn by Kirby on the first page of Captain America 1 in March of 1941. This image of Captain America slugging Hitler has not only been very timely given the Trump election and all these images that have been seen on this, but Mike Catron just did a presentation on Take That, Adolf. So this image, of course, you've seen on Cavalier and Clay from about 10 years ago, Pulitzer Prize-winning novel. The great Alex Ross has taken his stab at illustrating this. It's become almost indirectly one of Kirby's greatest icons. Now, one of the things you have to notice if you're interested in comic history is, where is the circular shield? Why is it this triangular shield? And a year before, almost, this character is created not by Simon and Kirby. It's the company that eventually does Archie comics. But there's no denying that there was resemblance, and something went on behind the scenes. I'm not too clear, because so much of comics history is in a kind of a fog of what do we really know for sure in certain things. But here is an image that I think is drawn by Joe Simon about how after issue 1 they did change Captain America's shield from the triangular to the circular. So there's issue 2, and he's already got the circular shield. So I think that was the sort of out-of-court settlement they had with Archie that, well, you know, they'll change him. Now, you know, all they did was really change the shield. But Captain America, complete overnight success. That's the issue that this kid is reading. Maybe the first example of cosplay in America, right? 1941, there it is. And the page that he's probably glued to is this "I want you, join the Captain America Club, Sentinels of Liberty." But that's exactly what Captain America was. He was the 20th century version of the great 19th century American icon, Uncle Sam. Now, I found this on the internet. There's so much great art on the internet, but it's anonymous, and I don't know whether it was actually used in the movie. But what was great about the movie that came out a couple years ago was they actually dramatized what actually happened in real life. They dressed up actors as Captain America, and they stumped for war bonds. And that's what I loved about the movie. They paid homage to it. There was an early serial with Captain America. He was one of the first, along with the early serials, one of the first superheroes to be portrayed on film. And then the knockoffs came because of Captain America's sales success. So everybody's punching Hitler. Right? Captain Battle, Minuteman. I mean, can't you see? These are the concepts that got published. Imagine the ones on the cutting room floor that did not. But of course, all of Marvel Comics, everybody's fighting the war along with Captain America. So you have the other Marvel characters, or Timely Comics, whatever they were called back then. And they were fighting what were called the Jap-Nazi rats, some weird amalgam of the Japs and the Nazis. And of course, Superman himself follows Captain America's lead. So everybody's fighting World War II because of the success of Captain America, forever melding superheroes with American ideals that are exemplified by this classic Fred Ray Superman cover. The problem is, what happened after World War II ended and they didn't have the Jap-Nazi rats to fight? You started to see comic covers like this, banal, a hello, and then, you know, Batman's not fighting Gotham City villains, he's out in space. And then you get other genres like Westerns coming into the superhero genre. And then as the 40s go on, and just like film noir in Hollywood, you start to get darker themes in comics, like, of course, the great EC, you know, horror comics. Don't you love the one on the right? I think when they asked Bill Gaines on the stand something about this image, like, I think it was that image. Don't you find that tasteless? And I think Bill Gaines says, well, it would have been really tasteless. I don't know, I'm losing the story. There's something significant about that.
If the head was higher, you could see the blood coming.
Right, there was something like, you think that's tasteless? No, that's not tasteless anyway. So the horror genre also took over the superhero genre. So fun characters like Captain Marvel and the more whimsical Plastic Man had to deal with this dread. Even Kirby and Simon's Captain America, when it was even eventually out of their hands, they lost control of it. And, you know, so Captain America turns to weird tales. So in the early 50s, Simon and Kirby are looking for other genres like everybody else, and they hit upon one genre, romance comics. And overnight, this becomes a multi-million-dollar sales success. Now, what's significant about the romance comics? Well, look at the very first piece of what is considered pop art. The 1956 Richard Hamilton collage, which is really only about this big. It's 8.5 by 11. Anyway, when we come in close, there it is, the young romance cover. So forever melding again, fine art exemplified by pop art with comic book art. It's always been there at the beginning, and we'll touch upon some of that later. Other than romance comics, they tried another stab at a kind of a knockoff of their own Captain America, Fighting American, and he was supposed to be fighting the commies. So you had ridiculous stories like Ivan and Hotsy Trotsky, and you know, they were trying to be so, you know, listen, you think humor's hard in real life, stand-up comics? Try humor in comic books. You know, that's really difficult to pull off. Every now and then somebody does it well. But anyway, they're looking for other genres. This is, you know, not many pictures of any of these guys exist. So when you see pictures that are as degraded as this, it's because it's all that exists. They tried another knockoff of Captain America in the late 50s for Archie Comics. Remember Archie Comics? They were the ones with the shield. So they did another knockoff of the Shield and Captain America, the private life of a Private Strong, Lancelot Strong. And the interesting thing when we talk about Spider-Man in a little bit is that a lot of Private Strong's story you'll end up finding in the early Spider-Man. So when we talk about who created Spider-Man, more and more you see Jack Kirby had a lot more to do with Spider-Man than anybody thinks. But the Shield doesn't succeed either, and basically Simon and Kirby by the end of the 50s split up. Kirby is solo, and he decides to go to where else, back where he once was, DC Comics, because he's aware of the trends. He sees what DC's doing, the return of the superhero with the beginning of the Silver Age, the Flash, and all of DC's renovated characters from the 1940s. So Kirby goes back to DC Comics. Remember in the 50s, it's hard to make a living in comics because of the comics code, and they were accused of causing juvenile delinquency. Sales dropped. People lost their careers. It was a really horrible time. So artists like Jack Kirby, who had a young family to feed and mortgage to pay, had to take on anything. So he goes to DC Comics and does his version of a green character, Green Arrow, created in 1941 by Mort Weisinger, believe it or not. And now DC has published a whole archive edition of the Green Arrow stories. But this is what Kirby was doing, you know, just trying to do decent stories with it, whatever he was handed. But so much of his Green Arrow you will find in the Arrow TV show. Then he creates a team of 4 adventurers called the Challengers of the Unknown in the late 50s for DC Comics. And what you see here in his Challengers work are a lot of motifs you're going to see in his later, more mature period when we get to the 60s with the Fantastic Four. But what's most significant and what's best about Challengers of the Unknown is that Kirby was inked by the late, great Wally Wood. Wally Wood, who of course we could do a whole nother visual lecture about, but if you know Wally Wood, you recognize the style of shading that, you know, was a Wally Wood trademark. And just on a pure artistic level, this combination that only lasted about 3 years in the late 50s between Kirby and Wood I can't really vouch for the stories because it's like, stories, who needs stories when you just want to just look at every panel of this juicy Wally Wood inking. But things don't work out at DC. There's a whole lawsuit, believe it or not, over Sky Masters, and it poisons Jack's relationship with DC Comics literally for decades. And that's also a whole nother story. But suffice it to say, it forces Kirby to go back to Marvel Comics, or it was known in the late 50s as Atlas Comics. It was once known as Timely Comics, and that's the logo. I don't know whether Kirby designed it, but look at the original Timely Comics stationery with the Simon and Kirby characters. There you got the Bill Everett Submariner there. And there's Martin Goodman, the owner, and he happens to be Stan Lee's uncle or cousin. I don't know, has it ever been cleared up? Uncle? Cousin?
It's uncle. I think it's uncle.
Think it's uncle?
I think it was uncle by marriage, too.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, part of the fallout, and again, remember I told you there's a lot of material to cover in our little time here, but I mean, believe it or not, Simon and Kirby lost control of Captain America, and Martin Goodman, later on in the 40s, ends up publishing this How to Do Comics pamphlet and takes the entire credit for creating Captain America. So he's still there in the late 50s when Kirby basically has to eat crow and go back to this company that is now in the hands of young Stan Lee, who Kirby remembers as being like a snot-nosed kid in 1941, you know, whatever he was doing around the office while Kirby was, you know, pushing out pages. But there he was now, editor and head writer, the only writer really, at Timely Comics, because it was a pretty low-budget operation. But they team up together, Stanley Lieber and Ya'akov Kurtzberg, Jack Kirby, and Stan Lee. And they start doing these monster comics in the late 50s. And, I mean, Googam, Rambu, Grog, the names go on, and everybody has, I think, a favorite. Fin Fang Foom is usually a favorite of everyone. But Kirby obviously has his sights set on far more doing in Marvel Comics than these monsters. This is a picture circa early 60s, not really the time frame I wanted, but again, there's not that many pictures. But he's aware, again, of what's happening at DC Comics. That Justice League of America, which was the amalgam of all the retrofitted DC superheroes, is selling well. And there's many stories about this, but to make a long story short, Martin Goodman comes back and basically tells Kirby and Lee, you gotta knock off the Justice League of America. It's doing well. So, according to all the history I've read and I've heard and I've looked at, what I think happened is that Kirby and Lee probably had a discussion about how they're going to knock off the Justice League of America. And I think after they had that discussion, which probably Kirby, who was the creator, and we'll go into that in a little bit, this is the infamous type synopsis that Stan Lee supposedly wrote that's been authenticated by Roy Thomas, claiming that it appears as if Stan Lee wrote a script ahead of time that he just gave to Kirby. The reason why this is important is that this is the so-called smoking gun that people on Team Lee, as I would call them, like to point to and say, oh, Jack Kirby didn't create the Fantastic Four, Stan Lee did. Look, there's a synopsis. Well, as much as I would look at this, and based on everything else I've read and learned, I would say maybe Lee did indeed type this, but I think this was typed up after he had a discussion with Kirby. Because out of this you get Fantastic Four #1 in this, in the fall of 1961. And basically this kicks off the Marvel Universe. Now look at the very first cover, and you can see the large monster menace, a leftover of their monster comics, with the, you know, the knockoff of the DC characters. But more than a knockoff of the Justice League of America, I think the real way to look at the success of the Fantastic Four and where Kirby, the creator and storyteller of the Fantastic Four, got it from. He got it from the Challengers of the Unknown. There's been a whole article in the Jack Kirby Collector about this matching up issue by issue. But here are the, you know, from the origin of the Fantastic Four going off into space, and they're 4 adventurers, and of course you've got the 4 adventurers of Challengers of the Unknown. But almost story for story, the first 10 or 12 issues of Fantastic Four, you can find parallels in the Challengers of the Unknown. But here's the well-worn story of the Fantastic Four. The spaceship goes into space, hit by cosmic rays. Kirby was always reading up on science fiction and popular mechanics and what was happening in the space race at the time in the late 50s. This all comes out of Kirby's imagination. The ship crashes and the cosmic rays transform each one of the four characters into the Fantastic Four. So you have the Thing. But each one of these archetypes, you could find earlier archetypes in Kirby's own work. You can find an orange rock monster in one of the, collaborations with Lee. But when you look at an early pinup of the Thing and how monstrous he is, he's very golem-like. This is a statue of the golem in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, based on a Jewish legend from the 17th century about a rabbi trying to save the Jews from the pogroms, creates a living being out of clay to help save the Jews. And originally the golem, this beast of strength but no mind, no soul, saves the Jews, but then because he has no mind or soul, he ends up killing everybody. So the same rabbi has to put him down, and that is the legend of the golem. Well, is that not where maybe seeping in Mary Shelley's European consciousness 200 years later comes up with Frankenstein? I mean, even the first movie is practically based on the silent movie, The Golem, from I think 1926 or something like that. But in The Golem is where you'll find Jack Kirby's The Thing. We'll talk about this classic story a little bit later on. Then you have Mr. Fantastic, right? He stretches, well, hello, Plastic Man, yeah. Even DC Comics in 1960, maybe 59, but I think 1960, they knock off Plastic Man, but leave it to DC Comics. They looked in a dictionary for synonyms for plastic, and they came up with the word elongated. Everybody sitting here, if you grew up with these comics, you were probably the only kid in sixth grade to know what the word elongated meant. There are adults now that don't know what the word elongated means, but that's why we love comics, right? Then you have the Human Torch, and hello, of course, the Human Torch is the 1940s Human Torch of Marvel Alone. So Kirby basically said, you want us to knock off the JLA? They're retrofitted characters. Of course, Kirby didn't use the word retrofitted back then, but he basically said, so what do we have? We have the Human Torch, let's just revamp him. We have, these monsters, let's do a monster. So they did what they can do, but I mean, Human Torch, there's Challengers of the Unknown. Invisible Girl, Invisible Woman, whatever we want to call her. Kirby himself did a story for, I think, DC House of Mystery in like 1956 or 57. I mean, it's all, Kirby as a creator who had to make a living and support a family. Like all great creators and musicians, they recycle concepts and they make them fit. I'm a Bruce Springsteen fan. He's used lyrics from a 1973 song in a 2002 song that were just laying around waiting for him to use. So here's the final image of Fantastic Four #1, and here's how I used it in a double-page spread of my book, basically telling the story. And my whole book and design concept is really using layers, but to really show, I put the synopsis, but I put it in the background. And that's my way of saying, just through my image placement alone, that I place more prominence in what Kirby drew and created than what Stan Lee has supposedly written. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Thank you. So everything in the Fantastic Four ended up becoming the foundation of Marvel Comics universe. In issue 4, they bring back the Submariner again. They own the Submariner. DC successful with Aquaman. Let's do it. So there's, of course, him fighting those Japanese rats. And when you look at the Kirby version of this, which he's doing the Bill Everett original version, but I mean, you have to tell me that's where they got this idea from, right? Right? Then the next issue, or issue 5, he creates the ultimate Marvel Comics villain, Dr. Doom. Here's the way he started out, the more mature Kirby style. In the later 60s, we get the definitive Dr. Doom with images like this. And once again, an influence on this little-known cult movie villain. But I mean, George Lucas was working at a comic book store in San Francisco in the late 60s. So I mean, everything in Star Wars, the Force, comes out of Kirby's The Source, and on and on and on. And you know, Luke, you were my father, comes out of Orion. And I mean, again, we'll go into that in a little bit. But suffice it to say, Doctor Doom does live up to the premise, and it's in these Fantastic Four annuals and everything that the whole Marvel Foundation has laid. One of the great early issues that Kirby produces in 1963 is this hate monger issue, unfortunately inked by George Russo. I don't know if Mark Evanier's here, but I don't like George Russo's inks, but that's a little esoteric. Suffice it to say, it's Kirby doing his take on the rise of the Ku Klux Klan during the early struggle of the Civil Rights era. And when you read these words, if you've been following our recent politics of the last year, I don't think I need to project an image of you-know-who to make my point. At the end of the story, they pull off the hate monger's mask, and who is he? He's Adolf Hitler. What the? But you know, this is the Kirby that fought in Patton's regiment against Hitler. These stories came from somewhere. This is the Jewish Kirby. This is the humanist, the liberal, the classic, and yes, the thing's Jewish. This comes from a Hanukkah card he had made. But like I said, of all the characters, he most enjoyed drawing Captain America, but he most identified with the Thing. He said of all the characters, the Thing is the one that's most like him, talks like him, moves like him, acts like him. So that's who he identified with. Another monster he creates, also because of the success of the Fantastic Four, is the next Marvel, quote, superhero, the Hulk. Here's an early ad, right? The Marvel style ads. Now, anybody that knows the Hulk has to ask, why is he gray and not green? Now, when you get to the origin of the Hulk, everybody thinks, well, it's all about the Jekyll and Hyde thing. You know, I think a lot of that is what Stan Lee talked about that came after the creation. But this is another creation that I think comes out of the dictum of Martin Goodman, publisher, because he was very savvy in looking at marketing trends. The 1961 biggest selling toy was the first Aurora monster model, Frankenstein, painted by the great James Bama. The great James Bama! Tough crowd. Anyway, the reason why the Frankenstein is green is because, you know, the movies were black and white. They needed a full color thing, so Frankenstein's green. Anyway, because the success of Fantastic Four, the Thing being the standout character, Martin Goodman again says to Kirby and Lee, can you give me a superhero version of Frankenstein? Well, when the first issue comes out, he must have been aghast when he saw what Lee claims he had colored gray, because Lee must have forgotten the dictum from his uncle saying superhero Frankenstein about the greenness of it, and thought, because Lee has said on record, he thought the color gray would be spookier for a monster. But what must have happened is that Martin Goodman saw this and probably said, where is my superhero Frankenstein? And that's why with the very second issue and forever after, the Hulk has been, you know, the jolly green giant of Marvel Comics. So successfully he's had movies of his own. And even in the Avengers movies, he's become more of the star. Even in this promotional image, you can see how prominent the Hulk is. But the other prominent character over there is Thor, that, you know, a younger audience is going to recognize from the movies. In my intro, I give you the very first image of Don Blake hitting his hammer, and there's the first origin sequence by Kirby. There are so many precedents for not only the fact that Thor comes out of mythology and was public domain, but Kirby himself did so many early Thor stories that in trying to edit this presentation down, I'm like, what do I leave out? Like I said, I could do 45 minutes just on how many Kirby precedents for a comic book version of Thor as both a hero and a villain. But there's the first appearance in 1962, and Thor's originally supposed to be Marvel's Superman. That's why you have the red, yellow, and blue motifs. But as the next year and so goes by, 1964, you get the great inker Chick Stone coming into ink Kirby, just as Kirby's style becomes more muscular and dynamic and you begin to see that in this 1964 Thor. Then in 1965, Kirby takes another leap in development and starts really making these Thor stories less on Earth and more on Asgard and more godlike. So you start to get images like this that are biblical in their iconicness because they comes right out of the Bible itself. You have Kirby's take on other mythological characters like Hercules. Now, again, I could do another 45 minutes just on what was happening over at DC Comics at the same time. That was so staid. I mean, listen, I love Kurt Swan, inked by George Klein. That has nothing to do with it. But I mean, you cannot compare what was happening at DC with what Kirby was doing over at Marvel. I mean, musculature like that does not exist in reality. Yes, we know that. But in Kirby's reality, it exists. Kirby does his own version of the Pietà. I mean, come on. If the aliens were here and they were burdened by 400 years of art history telling them that this image was better than this image, I would think they would agree with me that, hey, they're both great. I don't put one above the other. They're both great versions of an Earth parent mourning their dead child. The other thing that was cool about what Kirby and Lee start doing with the Marvel superheroes is they start merging them with the actual real world. So you get the Marvel characters way before DC did anything about Vietnam. They're actually fighting in Vietnam. And you get covers like this. A cover like this, February 1966, why is this cover significant? Well, in January of 1966, the first legal acid test poster before they made LSD illegal, you've got right in the center there Jack Kirby. That's Ken Kesey himself, on the magic bus that he traveled across the country dosing America in 1964 with then legal LSD. Then legal. Just lost my train of thought there for a second. The bus there, according to Tom Wolfe, who wrote, thank you, the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, the bus was festooned with Marvel Comics characters. Tom Wolfe says that Ken Kesey himself was in the back of the bus plunging in the purple shadows of Steve Ditko's Doctor Strange. So the Marvel characters were psychedelic before psychedelia even happened. This is a black light poster produced in 1970, by whoever. And it's, the black light colors, people that are old enough will remember going into your, friend's basement with those black light bulbs. Help me out here, you know what I'm talking about. But how much more psychedelic was this than the actual comic book full page image? You don't need to make it more psychedelic than it already is. This is like 1967. 5 years earlier, that's Thor. Same month Thor comes out, Spider-Man 1 comes out. And remember I told you, this is a little significant, you think Kirby has nothing to do with Spider-Man? Well, Simon and Kirby, in 1953, pitched a concept called Spider-Man. There was actually a logo. That didn't go anywhere. They create a story that they call the Silver Spider. It's about a teenage boy with a ring that turns him into a superhero. And they get C.C. Beck, the Captain Marvel artist, to draw it, but it's still a concept owned by Simon and Kirby. They pitch it, it doesn't go anywhere. A couple years later, I think Kirby on his own comes up with a concept called Night Fighter. And he can cling to walls, he's got suction cups, you can see there. Looks like a classic Kirby, character almost, the gun belt like that. But you can see the wall crawling ability is there. Then, Simon and Kirby, the last thing I think they create together is the superhero pitch for Archie Comics for The Fly. I think debuts in 1959, 2 or 3 years before Spider-Man. And other than, pretty much all the superpowers of The Fly pretty much match up with Spider. What's interesting is there's a Spider villain in here. But as the other version of the history has it, is that this is a drawing by Steve Ditko, done in 1990, I believe. And he talks about how Lee gave Kirby the initial story, not the initial story, meaning Kirby did draw out a story once he got to Marvel to pitch Stan Lee based on some of those Silver Spider concepts. And according to Ditko, who saw those pages, and nobody else has ever seen those pages, he said the character looked like this character that he calls Kirby Spider-Man, which looks a lot like Night Fighter. And Ditko makes a claim here that it is the visual costume itself that is the de facto co-creation of a superhero. So whatever the story is, it was supposedly Ditko said to Lee that it looks too much like The Fly, and that's why it was given to Ditko. We're still trying to parse the story. In the very latest Jack Kirby Collector, I recommend you read an incredible article that goes in depth, if you're interested in this, on the creation of Spider-Man and all these concepts, which once again can fill an entire presentation. But hey folks, this is why we're gonna run over, because how you gotta touch on this stuff. But there is Ditko's version of Fantasy 15, but supposedly Lee didn't feel this was dynamic enough and gets Kirby to pencil with Ditko inking Spider-Man 1. I happen to believe this is for Kirby a phoned-in layout. You know, we're still debating this in my comics history groups on Facebook about whether this is a, quote, great cover. I just find it a little bit sort of ruins the story that Lee likes to tell. If he took Spider-Man away from Kirby because it was too dynamic, and then gave it to Ditko, but then Ditko gives him a cover that Lee doesn't think is dynamic enough. So he gives it back to Kirby. So like that logic doesn't quite make sense. And I happen to think the Ditko cover is better, and as an artist myself, I think it's a shame that you do the entire interior of a comic and your cover gets rejected. I think that's really wrong just on a moral level, but this is comic history, and this is the cover we have. Kirby also pencils the first Spider-Man #1 cover. So in Kirby's mind and in his story, based on all the background, Kirby believes he as much as anybody, and all the evidence seems to point that Kirby had more to do with the creation of Spider-Man than either Ditko or Stan Lee. So here's with the Marvel ad for the next creation from the Kirby Lee Dynamo, and it's the original clunky Iron Man who's become a sort of a fetish object himself. I love this Altoid ad, and didn't we love the fact that the first Iron Man movie paid homage to the clunky Iron Man from the very first origin story that took place in, yes, Vietnam? And when you look at the creation of Iron Man, the fact that he was a guy that was going to die if he didn't have the machinery, you know, checking his heart. Well, when you look at the anime of Tobor the Eighth Man, who appears on American television in 1966, he's a cop that gets, you know, riddled with bullets, and he's remade by scientists. There's a lot of Iron Man in Tobor the Eighth Man. There's a lot of Iron Man in RoboCop because it's the same basic story. So the archetype of Iron Man has become, you know, much imitated and much duplicated, but here's one of the very first house ads that Kirby draws with the initial stable of the Marvel characters. Now look at that little bug character, that's of course the Ant-Man. He appears in September '62, which is a year after DC Comics does their version of a miniature character, the Atom. So it starts out Ant-Man, he doesn't have a costume, then they give him a costume. But suffice it to say, he's one of the foundation Marvel characters, and lo and behold, you know, now everybody knows him. I mean, who would have thought that Ant-Man would become one of the major Marvel movie characters? But there he is, one of the foundation members of the Avengers. And now the American public, thanks to the movies, of course, knows all about the Avengers. Kirby must have done this last panel right about the time that this event occurs. And it's this event that prompts Kirby to believe it's high time that we brought back Captain America. So to help heal America, just as much as the Beatles came in early '64, you have Captain America reappearing on the scene. Now, Marvel tried to revive Captain America in 1955, a year before DC's Flash kicks off the Silver Age. After 3 issues of being a commie smasher, they fail. And I think they fail because, unlike the Flash, who gets brought back in a different costume, Captain America was brought back in the same costume, so maybe that's why he failed compared to the DC retro characters who succeeded. But there's the issue where he rejoins the Avengers, and within 1 year, he becomes the de facto leader of the Marvel Universe and the actual leader of the Avengers. He's so successful in the very first year of coming back, they give him his own backup story and sharing the title. One of the very few times Kirby returns to Iron Man when he's got the red and yellow outfit. Designed by Steve Ditko, by the way, if anybody saw my earlier presentation. The thing about Captain America that made it Kirby's favorite character to draw, that he talks about, and in my book he goes into detail, but it was all about the movement and the action. The fact that Captain America is literally leaping off the page. It's all about this fighting that Kirby grew up with as a kid on the Lower East Side, fighting on the tenement ceilings, but you can feel the tension. That's a master cartoonist at work. The use of the lines, knowing which lines to use, but this body language also comes from deeply lived experience. That while Kirby himself was not muscle built like this, he understood what it was like to be tied up like that, probably in the war, I bet. And then the release, the tension and the release that Kirby gives you in panel after panel of Captain America. And he even says in my book that he choreographed fight scenes like violent ballets. And when you look at these incredible images, and once again, budding cartoonists out there, the use of force lines is a primer in itself in his Captain America stories. So much of the power you feel in this image is because of the master cartoonist's use of force lines. So influential on the comic book field that other artists at the other rival companies like Gil Kane at DC Comics, who actually when he was a young kid named Eli Katz, mentored with Jack Kirby. And here he's at DC Comics in 1966 trying to approximate Kirby's dynamics into his own work, just as the other Marvel Comics artists were trying to emulate Kirby. But then Gil Kane goes to Marvel in 1967 and draws Captain America and brings it full circle and gets the Kirby dynamics. You can see the influence of Kirby and everybody from Gil Kane to the great Bruce Timm, who I'll be talking about in my Monday presentation on the 25th anniversary of the Batman animated series. But just like with Thor, it's not only the movement in this image, it's the fact that Captain America is fighting in Vietnam, way before any of the superheroes got involved. So that is what helped Marvel overtake DC, first in consciousness and awareness, and then eventually in the early 70s in sales. But it's panels like this. That is why in 1969, Peter Fonda is called Captain America in the famous Easy Rider movie. It's also why when the Museum of MoCA in Los Angeles, Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles in 2006 had their exhibition of Masters Americana art, one of the first mainstream museum exhibitions of comic art in America. They ended up using one of Kirby's iconic Captain America images. I don't happen to like Sid Shore's inks, but we can discuss that at my table anytime over the next 3 days. But it is part of this iconic cover, and this is why you have the success of the movie Captain America, because of what Kirby did with the character that seeded ideas and success like this, and why he's the leader of the Avengers. Now, the other movie property that comes out of Kirby's imagination, of course, is the X-Men, appearing in 1963, right after Iron Man. Their Dr. Doom is Magneto, and there he is. And when we come in close on that helmet, you can see that the movies were actually pretty realistic in getting Kirby's designs. But when we come in close on another Magneto close-up, and then you look at this panel that was from, I think, X-Men #1, you astute art lovers will, of course, recognize Roy Lichtenstein's image duplicator. Lichtenstein knocked off so many Marvel comics that Martin Goodman or Lee decided for about 4 months in 1965, the peak of pop art awareness in the American culture, they decided to call their comic books pop art productions. It's not the first time that Magneto appeared outside of comics in the pop culture. In the early 70s, McCartney, big comic book fan, does a song, Magneto and Titanium Man, That art is actually George Tuska knocking off Kirby. It's not actually Kirby, but it's a Kirby design, of course. There's McCartney and Linda there in the bottom on stage. Here they are backstage and giving a cake that, Kirby's giving them a cake that they had a drawing of, and big fan of Kirby's. Frank Zappa loved Kirby. Kirby was a big favorite of the counterculture because they saw in him a kind of folk psychedelia mentor of sorts. And then when you think of Lennon McCartney in the 60s and what they did for rock and roll, you've got to look at what Kirby and Lee did as comics in the 60s as parallel. Now, the relationship between the Beatles and comics is not that tenuous because 3 years before the Beatles came to America in '64, the original title of the Fantastic Four was going to be the Fabulous Four. But Martin Goodman thought Lee's title was a little fey, so he had him change it right before it went to press. Had Martin Goodman not stuck his big nose in, they would have been the first Fab Four of the 60s. You know what I'm talking about? Anyway, this is another spread from my book, and I go into that whole connection. And it was in the Fantastic Four that the entire Marvel universe of the 60s debuted. And it's covers like this that only Jack Kirby would have attempted and pulled off, drawing literally every creation of his on one single cover. And here's Kirby in late 65 or early 66, justifiably proud of his creations. All of his characters were the models in those icon boxes. That was actually Steve Ditko's idea. And as the 60s went on and Martin Goodman started to do more licensing deals, you start to see images like this that basically appropriate most of Kirby's designs as becoming the kind of brand image of Marvel Comics. Now, at the same time this is happening, Kirby's artwork itself is taking a developmental leap. This is from 1963. Only a year later, look at this image, and you can see Kirby's mature style, once again, inked by Chick Stone. Some people don't like that thick magic marker line that Stone put around Kirby's figures, and some of us do. It's something we're still debating. But Kirby starts experimenting with collage in 1964, and you start to see iconic covers like this. The next major development that actually changes Kirby's way of doing comics is in '66 when the Batman TV show hits. Now, Marvel was prepared in '65. Everybody knew Batman was coming. So one of the fallouts of the Batman TV show that was beneficial for Marvel was the Marvel cartoons got to be on, and there's, Kirby's character in the lead. But the way Kirby actually responds in creation is that he creates more characters for Marvel to use to basically focus the attention on Marvel and less on Batman and all the Batman knockoffs DC, of course, ended up doing. So in my book on the double-page spread, I group all of the Inhumans that he creates in 1965 in anticipation of the onslaught of Batmania in 1966. And this is the sort of postmodern Kirby costume design when he starts incorporating these Aztec motifs into the design. If you want to call them Aztec motifs. I did a whole article about the graphic designs of Jack Kirby, and we're trying to figure out where he got this from. And, again, we can do a whole presentation just on the graphic motifs of Kirby. But his characters and his style becomes bigger, bolder, and even more godlike and machine-like. The heroes look like the machines, and machines almost take on an organicness even within all the technology. And nowhere is that better seen than in the creation of this guy in 1966, that we're not sure when we first see it in this panel. Are we seeing what we think we're seeing? Is that a guy riding a surfboard? Yes, it's a guy riding a surfboard. Early '66. What is Kirby influenced by? The surf movie Endless Summer that comes out in 1964. That is the first great true surfing movie among you surfing buffs. And it's the first great documentary, really, about a sport ever made, well, other than Lenny Riefenstahl's Trying for the Will, right? I think after that, you gotta say, right, Endless Summer? Thank you, Michael. Anyway, the thing about the Silver Surfer, the reason why they couldn't make a movie out of him until 2007 is because the technology. They wanted to make a movie out of him starting in 1968. the reason why they couldn't is they couldn't figure out how to film a guy on a surfboard convincingly. So it was only when the computer came along and the effects were such, and listen, we can critique whether they succeeded or not, but it's interesting how when Kirby creates him, his idea of a surfboard is this giant tub. And that comes from, again, the very debut of the Silver Surfer. Now, again, we can get into a long discussion about the role of Stan Lee in the so-called creation of these foundation Marvel Comics characters and stories. Suffice it to say, I would like to take the position that Stan Lee maybe gave Jack Kirby a phone call sometime in late '65 and maybe said to him, hey Jack, have the FF fight a really big villain next issue. And I like to believe that what Kirby does in his little Long Island basement studio where he worked all night long while his family was asleep upstairs, he comes up with the Watcher, Silver Surfer, Galactus trilogy, which is in Jack's mind his idea of God. Now the Watcher comes out of the Bible. It's one of the characters there. This is a comic. It's not by Kirby. It's something I found in Charlton Comics. But there is a Watcher-like character. And it's not that dissimilar from Kirby's debut in early '66, which means he's writing it and creating it in the fall of '65. Once again, in the space of maybe 4 years, look how Kirby depicts the Watcher in maybe the single greatest drawing of the Watcher ever made, I think from 1970 or so. But this kind of galactic regalness of Kirby's that's become such a recognizable motif, we first find that in his first depiction of his idea of a godlike character, Galactus. Now, the very first time we see him, he's colored in this red-green motif. I don't know if Kirby had color choices. People maybe like Mark Evanier and other Kirby experts might know, but the very next issue, we get the more familiar purple, but I think purple and brown, I think the brown was changed too eventually later on. But gaping at these two godlike characters is the Fantastic Four, and look at the credit box that Stan Lee's credit is. Look at what he did for creators. He gave them credit. So this incredible Galactus Silver Surfer trilogy, it was written by Stan Lee, and it was illustrated by Jack Kirby. Now, in the mind of a layman, not a writer or an artist or even a comic book fan or anybody in the creative arts, in the mind of a layman, written by usually means they created it, they wrote it first. The graphic placement of the writer above the artist speaks volumes, especially if you're an artist. If you've worked at an ad agency, you know that if you're an art director, the copywriter is elevated above you because they're masters of words. And you're just a guy that has no people skills that sits in a corner and can make pretty pictures, right? Right? My point is that when you talk about great songs, it's always the guy who wrote the lyrics comes first before the guy that wrote the music. Why? Well, he's a master of words. Well, a couple of years ago, I was sick and tired of this whole idea that Stan Lee created everything because he, quote, wrote it. So I ended up writing and designing my own manifesto based on the auteur theory of film called the auteur theory of comics. And essentially, I take the great movie directors who the original French critics in the 50s were trying to tell the American public, you idiots, your movie directors who you think are just slick commercial filmmakers are actually artists. In fact, forget about who wrote the screenplay. It's the guy that directed the movie. And here I morph, I just blanked on his name.
De Palma?
No, the French guy. What's his name?
Truffaut.
What? Truffaut. Thank you. Francois Truffaut morphing into Jack Kirby. And I do the 16-page verbal visual essay that I basically demonstrate that what Jack Kirby did, essentially, and what became known as the Marvel method, is the artist drawing out the story. Yes, Lee maybe gave him a plot idea, but you know what? That's what an editor does. If you believe the Stan Lee idea of creation, that he might have given the idea of the Silver Surfer story to Kirby, well, you know what? then if you know about the way DC Comics were created, that would mean that editors Mort Weisinger and Julius Schwartz should be considered co-writers and co-creators of every comic book they published. But in the Marvel universe, Stan Lee gives an idea, maybe, as a good editor, which he should be given credit for. And Stan Lee might have written snappy dialogue. According to Lee himself, when Jack Kirby handed him 20 beautifully drawn pages of a story that came out of Kirby's mind, whether or not Stan Lee said anything, or even if he did, it doesn't matter. Only in the prose form are words ultimately the creation of something. If Stan Lee had written a book called Spider-Man in 1961, and not a comic book with Steve Ditko, then Stan Lee could claim he created Spider-Man. He claims Stan Lee because he wrote the dialogue, which according to him was like filling in a crossword puzzle. And eventually the story gets colored. This finished product is considered to be written by Stan Lee and illustrated. That means just drawn. Artists traditionally in the pop culture field have been known as pairs of hands, as wrists. What that means is we need somebody who can draw a pretty picture. We don't need their mind, we just need their skill. They're just a pair of hands. The Stan Lee version of creation treats Kirby, Ditko, John Buscema, et al. As wrists, as pairs of hands. And where does that come from? From Stan Lee himself. In 1974, he publishes the first of his Origins of Marvel comics. 4 years after Kirby's departure from Marvel itself, he's at rival DC. Marvel is about to be sold to one of their conglomerates. Long story short, the text introductions of this book by Lee himself were the first time I can recall seeing in print. Back then, I was 16 years old or whatever. And I remember reading, Stan Lee consistently writes for the record, for posterity. These text intros are still being quoted by the regular media. It's always, I created the characters and the stories, and then, oh, I got these incredible artists. Oh, Jack Kirby could draw anything. It's the ultimate backhanded compliment damning with faint praise that Lee has basically repeated for the last 40 years. And it's been encoded, and it's been knighted, and it's been, find me another synonym for what I'm trying to say. In my auteur theory verbal visual essay, I bring back my Kirby Beatles comparison, and I basically say that, you know, the Beatles had the right idea when they got together. Everything was Lennon-McCartney, 50-50, no matter what. If you know the history of the Beatles, you know that Hey Jude, the only thing Lennon contributed to it while he was on acid was telling McCartney to leave the line in, the movement you need is on your shoulder. For McCartney, that was just a placeholder. It made no sense to McCartney. But Lennon, probably tripping at the time, said, you know, I know what that means, the movement you need is on your shoulder. Keep it in. Well, he owns 50% of Hey Jude, the biggest selling Beatles single of all time. So that's the way it should have been with Lee and Kirby. But it was not that way. This is as much as Kirby got at Marvel, that to us young kids reading this, we read, oh, it means they did it together. But always stands, you know, comes first. Maybe it's no coincidence that in 1966, Kirby creates Ego, the Living Planet. And maybe there's a bit of resemblance. Should we go back and check that out? Yeah, listen, I did my best. You know, I was just putting this presentation together in the hotel room a couple hours ago. But anyway, the major character in contention here, the only time Lee slipped up and actually told the press back in the day that he had nothing to do with the character was the Silver Surfer himself. He says, oh yeah, you know, the pages came in and I saw this character. Whoa, Jack, what is that? The most maybe Lee did was come up with the name Silver Surfer, which, you know, he feels, well, I named him, so I created him. The other idea of this image, you begin to see the idea of Kirby Crackle. You know, there's a Kirby Crackle drink, I think. Everybody now. Where did Kirby get Kirby Crackle from? This is a photograph. Remember I told you Kirby was a science buff? He was reading Popular Mechanics and stuff like that? Well, this is a photograph of the first quasar from outer space that National Geographic prints sometime in 1965. And it was very influential on Kirby. He loved the idea that this energy field was these dots. So the very first time we really see Kirby crackle is the very first time we see Galactus. You can see the beginnings of it on the edges there of the energy, but there's not much Kirby crackle here. I would say if we had a Kirby crackle meter, I would put it on what, 10% Kirby crackle? Help me out here. But I got, okay. Anyway, see, I got me distracted. 5 minutes later, only a year later, in 1967, with this incredible image of Dr. Doom, do we get what I call mature Kirby crackle, right? This image, I believe, is the greatest example of victory and defeat in a single image, not only in the history of comics, I would say in the history of art itself. History and defeat, I mean victory and defeat in a single image. This energy field, Kirby really brings to the next level with this character Black Bolt as part of this whole Silver Surfer, Galactus, Inhumans, creation thing he's doing just to ward off the Batmania, believe it or not. Well, Black Bolt couldn't speak, but if he did speak, he had the power of atomic level destruction just from the sound of his voice. So we're all waiting for a year. When is Kirby gonna let Black Bolt loose? And he does it in 1967 with this unbelievable image of destruction. Now, when we strip away the color and get to Kirby's basic black and white, where does this image of destruction, and since we only have a couple minutes left, we might as well bring the presentation as full circle as I could bring it. But if you want to take a vote, I'll leave it to the will of the people if you want to continue. But again, take it up with the authorities. I have no power here. But all I'll say is, out of the Lower East Side, the congestion, the crumbling tenements, but at the same time, Kirby is an artist of destruction. He's an artist of creation, because these technological designs of Kirby's that mix so many graphic motifs from Aztec imagery to Art Deco. I mean, Kirby was doing computer circuitry before computers were invented. When you look at the end papers to the Kirby sketchbook and you see these designs, again, if you go into the fine art world, I always thought of Louise Nevelson's boxes, how you have these graphic elements in some kind of, it's like chaos within order. Well, chaos within order is really Kirby's Kirby tech. There's Kirby Crackle and there's Kirby tech. And then you've got his creation of the negative zone in 1966 as well. And this is where we'll come full circle, and I'll have to probably end the presentation here, with what everybody considers to be the single greatest Jack Kirby Fantastic Four story, with, of course, me doing the dialogue. This appears after the Galactus Silver Surfer Watcher trilogy. So how do you top that? A single issue standalone story that is considered the single greatest story in the whole Marvel Silver Age 60s canon. And it deals with Reed Richards getting stuck in this negative zone that Kirby creates, and you get sucked into the center, and if you get to the center, of course, you blow up. Well, to make a long story, or should I say a comic book story short, the bad guy who takes the impersonation of Ben Grimm, he's not really Ben Grimm, it's the bad guy in the Thing's body. He originally wants to kill Reed Richards out of envy and jealousy, but instead, because he sees Reed Richards' selflessness, it changes his heart and his mind, and rather than killing Reed Richards, he decides to save his life and sacrifice his own. And this is the true Kirby Lee creation, because this is Jack Kirby's story, but it is Stan Lee's dialogue. And I'll give Stan Lee props, because when you read these final words, as this bad guy goes to his death, repentant, and in a sense forgiven, because he made the ultimate sacrifice, which is, as Christ would say, laying down your life for your friend is the greatest thing a man can do. And that is what Kirby has this man do, with beautifully written dialogue by Stan Lee. So, what say ye? Am I continuing or?
Did I tell you this stuff?
Keep going.
I'm throwing myself to the mercy of the comic. Does everybody who wants to leave? I mean, listen, I'll do it. I'll continue. It's whatever you guys want to do. Okay, by popular demand. Okay. Okay, give everybody a chance to get, shuffling their seats or whatever.
Yeah.
By the way, you're making my convention just by agreeing to this. I want to let you know how grateful I am that I do this thing. Gotta admit though, I salvaged it and didn't have a good ending point. Come on.
I've got a question.
Well, what?
I have a question.
Should we take a break and have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Sure.
think of this as part one.
Okay.
Not that part two is going to be just as long, but again, I can't tell you how long it's going to be. I can figure out. But basically, we're in 1966, so you do the math. Yes.
The one picture you put up, it said, written in the manner of Stan Lee. If I saw anything like that, I would say it was not written by Stan Lee. Manner means you kind of take,
In the manner.
the way that,
Okay, now listen, I don't want to get
things are
sidetracked. Listen,
No.
I'm going to be at my table selling my Silver Age book the next 3 days. I'll be more than happy to entertain discussing the Stan Lee topic. Because obviously it is a major topic and it's still being debated to this day, regardless of the settlement. So we're going to continue, everybody? Yeah. Okay, I'm excited. So what's the next character Kirby creates in '66 to fend off Batmania? Well, he's not a hero. Marvel originally presents him as a villain. And this is the ad for, again, issue 52, the very next issue after This Man, This Monster, is the debut of the character, the Black Panther. Now, the way we see him on the cover here, we see him as this masked character, and again, he's been told to us that he's a villain, and yet, look at the copy there, the sensational. Rarely is a villain ever called sensational. So we young readers were a little bit confused when we saw Fantastic Four, and as we got older, we learned about the history of the Black Panther Party. This comic comes out in the spring of '66. The Black Panther Party is formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California in the fall of 1966. And they claim they based their name on a Louisiana voting rights group from 1964, I think in Alabama, excuse me, that called themselves the Black Panther Party. And they took their name, supposedly, from a college in Atlanta that had the Black Panthers as their team mascot. I mean, here is some, literature that we got from the that voting rights party in Alabama, and you can see them using the Black Panther as a mascot, basically against the white racist mascot. What's interesting about the first cover of the Black Panther, it's not the original Kirby cover. This one is. What's the major significant difference, of course? His face is exposed, that he's a black man. Marvel, maybe Martin Goodman, who knows, was concerned in 1966, right in the middle of the, Martin Luther King civil rights marches, right? They decide, you better put a full mask on the Black Panther because we're afraid that our southern distributors are going to reject the black superhero. What's even more ironic is that here is Kirby's original sketch done a year earlier for the first black superhero that he calls the Coal Tiger, C-O-A-L, I guess named after an actual tiger. I mean, it looks like Obama as a superhero. I mean, ahead of his time, a proud black man in 1965 or 66 saying, proud to be a superhero. This is James Brown as a superhero. Wasn't allowed. Even Kirby had a myth. I mean, this is a real historical base. There was an African king in what we now call Timbuktu. That Masu Mensa was his name. He was called the Black Moses, and he reigned for many years and kept it peaceful, didn't war, but he maintained the peace because they were sitting on some major load that Kirby turned into vibranium, but in real life, during the, I think, 12th century, so that's where Kirby based Black Panther, T'Challa, the African Prince, all of that. And even when he told the origin of the Black Panther and how his father was killed, blah, 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 he actually, now whether this is Kirby or whether this is Lee, but it's Kirby's telling the story, then Lee's putting in the dialogue based on Kirby's story. Well, the dialogue is exactly, when I did my research, like Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist leader that is considered the first guy to come up with the idea of African American, or in the early 20th century, major influence on Martin Luther King and the whole civil rights movement that follows him. He's in the 1920s. But he had, kind of like pre-Michael Jackson, this kind of very flamboyant military pseudo style. And once again, the military side of Jack Kirby that fought in World War II Patton never left him. And you can see its effect in the superhero comics, but you've got to read between the lines, or the panels as it were. Take his 1968 Mangog story, where this horrible Minotaur-like beast is raging across Asgard, about to bring on Ragnarok, which is, you know, like Armageddon, the end of the world. Well, where does Mangog come from? Well, in the Apocryphal Bible, there is the story of how Armageddon is going to be brought on by the twin gods of war who were called Gog and Magog. And thanks to the internet, I'm able to do this research, but supposedly the armies of Gog and Magog are going to convene in, you know, Megiddo, which is where you get Armageddon from, and blah, 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 blah. Well, what do you think Kirby is telling here? He's not telling the story of Gog and Magog. He's telling the story of another guy that rampaged across the land. It was this guy. In the Gog and Magog story, you get the Wanderers, who are these aliens that don't have a planet. Wandering Jews, which are the Jews of Europe that had to wander and eventually wind up in Israel. So it's in stories like Thor, where yes, they're Norse legends, etc., but they're really Kirby stories. I wrote about this in one of the Marvel Masterworks Thor reprints. If you have it, that contains the stories. It was nice that I was asked by the editor to write, and I wrote about that because I hadn't read Thor since I was a kid. And by the way, I couldn't stand Vince Gilligan's inking, so I think that helped me forget more of Thor than remember. So I had to reread these Thor stories a couple of years ago, and I wrote the introduction, and to me it seemed crystal clear that Kirby's telling a story about Hitler and Germany and the wandering Jews through the pages of Thor. Look at this image of Ragnarok that he does in Thor comics, and then look at this full-page image from a couple of years later when he ends up going to DC Comics, the rival of Marvel Comics, and does this in his new book, The New Gods. And why he left Marvel and why he split up with Stan Lee is again the subject of an entire presentation. Suffice it to say that if you live through it, I know from my older brother who was a Kirby devotee, it was the equivalent in comics of the Beatles breaking up in 1970. It destroyed my brother's love for comics themselves. He couldn't get into Kirby's work. First of all, like me, we didn't like Vince Gilligan's inking. Mike Royer didn't start inking Kirby's DC work for like a year. But in that year, my brother just was so turned off, and it ended up killing his total childhood love for comics. But Kirby had been nursing these New Gods concepts for years. But as his tenure with Marvel went on in the 60s, and Martin Goodman is making commercial deals, and Kirby and Ditko are not being given promised royalties, etc. Again, a whole nother presentation. But he decides he's not going to give Marvel any more of his creations, especially the things he ends up giving to DC in 1970. This was the first ad in late 1970. You can see the first issues were going to be on sale in December of 70. But this was where Kirby's ideas, if you were reading Thor in the late 60s, this is where he was headed. And for the very first time, he decides to create interlocking titles in a comic book company, which had never been done before. The Marvel method was to interlock the characters and the stories, but never before as predetermined as this, and somebody ended up dubbing them the Fourth World. But the Forever People are based on Kirby's idea of the counterculture generation, especially when he moves to California in 1969. Mr. Miracle, Super Escape Artist, is based on Jim Steranko, the great Marvel Comics artist who was an escape artist. But the premier title, the best of the group, is of course The New Gods. And you can see Kirby's next level of costume design. Remember I told you Black Bolt begins to introduce those kind of Aztec meets Art Deco motifs. Aztec meets Art Deco. Okay, I like that. Anyway, but yeah, you can see those same motifs here. But then, of course, who is the counter, the opposite number of Orion? But just like you have Luke and Darth Vader, you've got Orion and Darkseid. And many interpretations of who Jack Kirby intended Darkseid to be, but again, and based on the interviews I've read, Darkseid is essentially Richard Nixon. And I'm not kidding. I mean, right? That comes out of the horse's mouth. And if you lived through Nixon, who would now appear to be, you know, a panty-ass liberal, right? Right? But we who lived through Nixon, who represents the beginning of the downfall of American politics that we know today, he was Darkseid. Anyway, the other title was Kirby's idea. You know, DC wanted him to do something with Superman or one of their leading titles in addition to letting him do his own stuff. So Kirby basically didn't want to take away Kurt Swan's job. You know, he had that depression mentality of, I don't want to take away work from anybody. So Jimmy Olsen was one of the lower selling of the Mort Weisinger title. Long story short, they give Jimmy Olsen to Jack Kirby to do. But here's the problem. They give it to Jack Kirby, and then they don't trust Jack Kirby's own designs of Superman and Jimmy Olsen. This is the original penciled cover that became this. Look at that drawing of Superman. That's by Superman competent hack ghost artist Al Plastino. And only at DC did you have artists who actually drew like their names. Pat, Plastino, and Boring. Need I say more? Thank you. Thank you. No, if only one person laughs, it's a success. Anyway.
I wonder what's happening to his genitals there.
Well, hello, yeah. You know, sacred to the profane. I didn't want to go there. But the point I'm trying to make is, thanks to the Jack Kirby collector, we could see the beautiful before of Jack Kirby's pencils. I mean, look at that version of Clark Kent. Are you kidding me? But what did Carmen Infantino do? Which, according, he used the Nuremberg defense and blamed it on his corporate masters, that he was being told by the licensing division that you got to keep Superman on model. So he gets, and I love Murphy Anderson, but not redrawing and re-inking and repenciling Jack Kirby's heads. You ended up getting such monstrous images as a Jack Kirby pencil over-rendered by poor Murphy Anderson just trying to make a living, right? And you get horrible images like this. I truly believe, because there's a lot of great stuff in Jimmy Olsen, and again, we could do a presentation on just Kirby's Fourth World work, just on the Jimmy Olsen stuff. Suffice it to say that I put the desecration of Kirby's work in images like this from his Fourth World series on a proportional par with the tutus they painted on Michelangelo's Last Judgment. I said proportional. Because the New Gods was where Kirby's Fourth World most shine, where you got incredible double-page spreads like this. You got images that told entire stories that Kirby would leave behind by the next page. You also had images like this that Kirby had been playing around with from the 1950s. You've got some concepts that we're still debating. Is it too wacky? The Black Racer? After the Silver Surfer? Really, Jack? But again, we're still debating that. You've got awesome images that rank with some of the greatest Kirby images ever. Of course, beautifully inked, I hope you can hear me, by Mike Royer. I mean, look at those brushstrokes, right? And speaking of Mark Evanier, who I spoke of before, there's a young picture of Mark Evanier in the background. There's Carmen Infantino. What happened was, and this is another, I know I keep saying this to make a long story short, according to DC Comics, Kirby's Fourth World didn't sell. I interviewed Carmen Infantino, and I said, Carmine, I've heard all these years that you canceled, after only 2.5 years, you bring over a master from another company, you give him his books, and then, you know, they talk about it in Hollywood, you know, if Seinfeld had been treated like Kirby's Fourth World, it never would have become Seinfeld. You know, you got to nurture some things. For them to prematurely decapitate the fourth world after 2.5 years, I believe is sort of a conspiracy theory of my own, that they intended Kirby to fail to punish him from a corporate standpoint for beating them single-handedly in the 60s. And I think as a corporation, they were willing to accept a certain amount of financial loss. Let the books fail, just so we can teach that bastard Kirby a lesson, which gets into a backstory about Sky Masters poisoning him at DC. And this gets into, again, a whole nother story about why Kirby was blackballed at DC. So I asked Carmine, if the official story is that you canceled Kirby's Fourth World because the books were losing money, pray tell, how much money were they losing? And I expected him to tell me thousands of dollars each month. He told me, now again, I know these are 1972 dollars, but he told me each of the 4 books was losing $500 a month. After I picked my jaw up off the floor and adjusted the $500 for inflation, I said, Carmine, there were fans in 1972 that would have paid DC Comics $500 times 4 a month to keep the books published. I cannot believe that that is the reason that DC Comics canceled the Fourth World books. But what do I know about comic book finances? Maybe $500 was a lot back then. What do I know? Tom, do you buy that excuse? Kirby expert?
I don't know.
Thank you for that committal answer.
Could be, but there was a lot of other factors involved.
Well, what do I keep saying? There's more time to discuss these things, but I just wanted to touch upon that. Because after they canceled Fourth World, they were still sort of under contract to Kirby, so they said, Jack, come up with other stuff, make it a little bit less confusing. The Fourth World was like the equivalent of Lost. Too confusing, Jack. 4 books, interlocking concepts. Can you just make it simple, stupid? So what does Kirby come up with? The first of his many derivative concepts. I know they're fans of the Demon, but hey, the Demon itself comes out of his love for Prince Valiant. In one of the famous sequences, Prince Valiant takes a chicken skin and creates a mask, and Kirby pays homage to it and even keeps the wrinkles to show that it's a mask. You know, I'm not a horror guy. I like superheroes. It's Kirby trying to do a superhero horror thing. Listen, some people love it. What can I tell you? A little too derivative for me. Then comes Commandy. Derivative, hello, Planet of the Apes. You know, and supposedly Infantino claims he gave Kirby the idea. I think Kirby at this point, I think if you believe my conspiracy theory, I think DC succeeded in breaking his spirit. I think Kirby's work from 72 till he dies in 94 is an unfortunate slow decline in quality. Yes, there's still some good comics to come. Yes, some good concepts. But Kirby's art was never the same after those Fourth World books. And I know there are fans of Commandy that love it. He creates a whole world. There's some incredible double-page spreads, once again inked by Mike Royer. There's OMAC, that is the last thing he does for DC in 1975, which is this bizarre image that we're still trying to figure out 40 years later. Like, what the hell? It's both sexual and not sexual at the same time. How does he do it? Anyway, here's the sketch. Basically, OMAC is Kirby's futuristic version of Captain America. He's a super soldier. And all these concepts, Brother Eye in the Sky, I mean, it's all national security stuff that in the age of Snowden has come true. Like most of Kirby's stuff was visionary. There was some incredible art in OMAC, inked and lettered by Mike Royer there. And you can see as Kirby gets older, his work becomes even more sort of abstract. So after his time at DC ends, he decides, well, where is there left to go to? He has to go back to Marvel. So he goes back to Marvel. This is a promotional piece he does in 1978. He's at Marvel from 75 or so to 1980. And he returns to some, not all, but some of his old characters. Right in time for the bicentennial, he comes back to Captain America. You know, that face is inked by John Romita, you know. Yep. Don't get me started with how many pieces of Kirby's art has been desecrated like this by pointless, needless changes dictated by either Stan Lee or whoever editor was in charge, Roy Thomas at the time, Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, one of those guys. But in 1976, we get the Treasury size bicentennial battles, and there's a beautiful double-page spread panel that when I saw the pencil of it years later in the Kirby collector, one of my artist friends in New York, Adriano Moraes, when he looked at this image, he goes, you know, Arlen, it reminds me of Guernica. And I said, you know what, you're right. There's something in this image where it's got the energy, it's got the horror of war. It's an image that we saw or would see also in Kirby's work later. Look at how this image, in color especially, is contrasted with Goya's famous the 3rd of May, 1803 or 1808 or whatever the title of it is. And I do a whole presentation on the relationship between fine art and comic book art, and this is where Kirby's work begins to take on this whole other extra dimension. He returns to the Silver Surfer with Stan Lee writing. And this is the original cover. He gives the graphic novel in 1978. But at the time, the publisher, Simon & Schuster, they didn't want something comic booky for a cover of a comic book. So what do? They give it to the painter Earl Norham. Now, you can like Earl Norham if you want, but I happen to think this is one of the ugliest, most horrible paintings I have ever seen. And the fact that they rejected this in favor of this is just another. I mean, poor Kirby is like, who is the saint with all the arrows? Sebastian?
Yeah.
Kirby is the Saint Sebastian of comic book art. How many more slaps in the face can this poor man withstand? And there was some good art in the Silver Surfer graphic novel. It was inked by the great Joe Sinnott, so it got them back together. But there is, by the way, Galactus's final color motif, the classic red and blue, or purple, I should say, and blue. But nobody was that satisfied with this Silver Surfer graphic novel. He does a stretch on the Black Panther. Again, there was some nice art. There was something feral about the Black Panther. We liked the way he did those sort of dotted line gloves and stuff. But again, if the aliens come to Earth and they say, we only have room on our spaceship for a little bit of Jack Kirby, are you gonna give him the Black Panther from the late 70s? No. Are you gonna give him Devil Dinosaur? I mean, is the jury still out? Do we like Devil Dinosaur?
Yeah.
Okay, listen, whatever floats your boat. But what I do love about some of Kirby's late 70s comic work is it takes on this brutalist, abstract, psychedelic, ayahuasca, visionary, you know what I'm saying? I don't know what the hell it is. Now remember I told you, speaking of derivative concepts, if you love 2001 Space Odyssey and you love Jack Kirby, but why would Jack Kirby waste his precious time on knocking off what I believe, this is the film I'm giving to the aliens. If you want to, I'll give them this and Citizen Kane, one black and white, one color. But basically, one of the greatest movie of all time. And you got Jack Kirby doing a comic book series, somewhat based on the film. But you know, there was some
Machine Man.
There, we'll get to that. Hold on. Once again, I couldn't get everything in there, but yeah, we'll talk about that. There was some sort of earthbound art, but there's plenty of psychedelic art. But again, it's still Kirby trying to outdo the film itself. So while I like some of this artwork on a purely abstract level, you know, it's Kirby abstract, and people love it. So what can I tell you? But creating these sort of science fiction worlds is something that Kirby just did. He lived and breathed it, and he actually pitched in the late 70s. He was working to try to create a super science fiction theme park called Science Fiction Land, and these were his designs, and they came out of the science fiction author Roger Zelazny's Lord of Light. So these incredible drawings, of which Barry Geller just gave a beautiful presentation on with Mike Royer, we can see some of these incredible designs that combine all of Kirby's technological motifs. Once again, that sort of pan-world, Aztec, Eurasian, whatever you want to call it. Again, we're still trying to figure out how to even describe these. But look at this article from 1979. Anyway, this fell through. Then they thought, well, maybe we'll do something else with it. We'll make a movie. I forget. There's a whole story of the many different hands this passed through, but it winded up becoming a pitch for a movie called Argo. And if you remember the Ben Affleck award-winning Oscar film of a couple of years ago, but unfortunately, and I don't know if the reasons have ever come out, is it a family, a state thing, they wanted money, but even though Kirby's artwork, if you know the story, actually helped save lives, because they needed artwork that looked so convincingly real, that would look like production sketches for something that they would need to film in Iran, that they used Kirby's artwork and it helped literally save lives. But the fact that it wasn't used in the movie itself, here's a chance to get Kirby's name in an Oscar-winning film, that the artwork is actually the reason the movie exists. And yet, to the layman who saw this movie, here was a chance to educate them about Jack Kirby, and for whatever reason, Kirby's work was not used in the film. Now, another film or literary concept that once again Kirby derived from is maybe the best thing he did in his post-early Marvel Silver Age year, is the second time in Marvel when he does the Eternals, because this was sort of his continuation of this God concept that he had been fascinated with. Some of his best artwork of his later period at Marvel is in the Eternals, especially the first 4 issues inked by John Verpoorten, who I believe gives Kirby his best inking post-Marvel since Joe Sinnott. But we're still debating that in my forums. If you recognize this image from the movie Alien, congratulate yourself, because who knows, but you know, Kirby did it first. But this is the famous giant alien concept that you see in Jack Kirby's New Gods 3 years before the film was released. Has anybody ever gone on record that they were influenced? Did Geiger, I mean, was it Geiger's concept? Was it the director, what's his name, Ridley Scott? I don't know. But this Gods concept is something that ran through Kirby's, pretty much the rest of his life. In the late 60s, early 70s, he puts out this Gods portfolio where you can see where all the designs that we'd seen in Thor for years begin to take shape in these more generic gods. He begins to merge this God concept with this technology, but again, we've been seeing this since Galactus. When you look at this image that Kirby called God, and later said he was thinking of his father when he drew it, we see in these pen and ink versions Kirby's idea of God. I mean, there's the Kirby giant godlike knee, but you can see in abstract form God's face up there. But there's an attitude running through these God plates, because look at this image. This is how Kirby sees God, seeing the world as a mass of war and horror and terror and blood and death. Look at this image of God actually turning his back on the earth. This is a very different conception than Judeo-Christians would like to think of God's relationship with man. And yet, it was the way Kirby felt, at least he felt in 1970. And that, if anything, because I could go on, but if anything, the Michelangelo of comics is who we're celebrating this year on the centennial of his birth. So what better way than to end with this Michelangelo godlike image of creation coming off of Jack Kirby's drawing board from his mind. So I want to thank you for being here and for staying the extra mile.